Hello, boys and girls. Just got back from Hurricane Wings, and I thought I'd make a video here while I had the opportunity before we turn on. Well, actually, we DVR'd America's Got Talent. We're trying to catch that at the end. The last 6 performances were tonight, and tomorrow night they're going to announce who the winner is. So I'll be watching that on Wednesday. Anyway, we're still in Chapter 5, and we're going to pick it up. Please grab your textbook, and we are picking it up on page 130. Let's go. Okay, so this is under the heading in your notes of speciation and extinction, and all of the different things that determine how biodiverse an ecosystem is. That is, how many species can adapt and how many cannot. When we talk about speciation, really there's 2 kinds. So you need to have these definitions. Look them up if you need to. Allopatric speciation is natural speciation, and it is created by a geographic or reproductive isolation. Sometimes that geographic isolation isn't actually physically being separated, like a species that starts on a new island, for instance, in the case of Darwin's finches here. But it might be because of something like temperature changes or a change in the predators that are in a particular geographic region. The predators can't reach all the way to the southernmost part of the ecosystem, and so animals that are susceptible to that predator die in the north but don't die in the south. So then genetic information, some positive phenotypes end up overtaking the other in the species, and you end up with a new species altogether. But when you think of allopatric speciation, think of natural speciation and think of it as some sort of geographic barrier. Of course, the great example is Darwin's finches. A whole bunch of birds, well, one bird in particular, the common ancestor here, made it from South American mainland. He made it to the Galapagos Islands, and there was reproduction. Obviously you need more than one bird to make it. But once those birds reproduced, the birds went from island to island, and different food sources caused different advantages. So you had ground finches, and they needed much larger and stronger, sharper beaks to be able to break seeds and eat them. So their food source led them to have a phenotype with some very interesting beaks because of what they ate. On other islands, these seeds weren't available. No cactuses were on these islands, so these finches ate insects. And because they ate insects, they didn't need the strong, powerful beak that the seed eaters needed, but they did need longer, slender beaks to be able to reach in to wood and reach down into the ground to snag the insects that they were after. So anyway, this is an example of allopatric speciation because these different animals were separated on these different islands, had different food sources, so they developed different phenotypes. Over time, if the genetic difference is enough, they cannot interbreed anymore. And sure enough, that's what's happened with all of these finches. They do not interbreed. They are each individual separate species. They cannot successfully reproduce amongst themselves. Here's another example of allopatric speciation. You have a field with lots of different kinds of mice, and then a river arises. Could be some significant flooding over tens of years, decades, maybe even centuries. And so now these 2 populations of mice that were once one species are completely separated. Remember, something has to change in the environment. But if that change that occurs makes it, in this example, more beneficial to have a brown color than a white color, then that may become the dominant color of that species. And if something happens on this side that makes it an advantage to have white color, well, then the white will dominate. Eventually, the two populations become genetically distinct because it's more than just hair color. And you get to a point where these species will no longer interbreed, even if they're not separated anymore. Even if they come in contact with each other, they cannot interbreed. Again, allopatric speciation, natural separations that occur, usually geographically. The second kind of speciation is called sympatric. Sympatric means same. You know, allo means different. So with sympatric speciation, this is not natural. We usually do this ourselves. It's artificial, and it's done generally because of something called polyploidy. Polyploidy is when there's a genetic error during the development of the new offspring and there are extra chromosomes involved. Now, when we happen to discover that over time, we use that to our advantage. And you can see what an advantage how we have genetically engineered wheat over the centuries so that we have a common wheat today. This plant gives us great productivity. It gives us a lot of food based on, or as opposed to, the original wheat plant that's some hundreds of years old. So this was a genetic error and we took advantage of it. It's called polyploidy, adding genes into the organisms. Poly means many, so you get the idea. You remember haploid and diploid? Well, this is poly. It's many new genes being added. Okay, so that's about speciation. Let's talk about the pace of evolution. How quickly does evolution happen? Well, it's determined on 4 factors. You could probably have guessed what these were, but make sure that this makes sense to you. First, let's look at the graphs. Notice that the x-axis is all going from lesser to greater ability to adapt. So if there are fast environmental changes, it should make sense to you that a species would have a lesser ability to adapt to that change. If the changes happen fast and furious, the species doesn't have an opportunity to respond and react. If the environment is slowly changing, then species have a greater ability to adapt. And that's one of the things we worry about with so many people on planet Earth and our ability to cause fast environmental change. Are the species that we're affecting having the ability to make their adaptive changes? And if they're not, of course, they will eventually go extinct. The amount of genetic variation matters in the pace of evolution. And again, make sure this makes sense to you. But if there's not much genetic variation, then there's no ability for some beneficial gene to kick in. The more genetic variation there is, the more chance that when something changes in the environment, there's a gene, maybe it's not being expressed down here, but there's a gene available in the gene pool that will end up becoming a dominant gene, helping to save the species from extinction. Population size is another big thing. Small populations can benefit from beneficial mutations. Of course, the opposite is also true. A small population can be harmed much more quickly in a small population. So large populations, you cannot see the phenotype of the new beneficial phenotype. And then the last one here is generation time. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but species that have babies all the time, think like insects, cockroaches, the common housefly. These organisms, the female lays tens of thousands of eggs and is pregnant every couple months. That is a fast generation time. When you're giving birth to all of those offspring, and some of them might have a genetic variation that's beneficial to the species, you increase the likelihood of being able to adapt to change. Long generation times, like for large mammals, it takes a female elephant gives birth to one, maybe two in her lifetime, and it's a very, very long gestation period. She's pregnant for a long time. These species are much less able to adapt than a species that has a short generation time. In fact, that's why we say probably the most perfect organism to be able to withstand any sort of environmental change is the cockroach. It could probably withstand a nuclear blast, because whatever's left behind, however we've changed and altered the environment, those roaches have such a short generation time and have so much in their gene pool that they will be able to find a way to adapt to that change. Okay, well, that is the pace of evolution. Let's move on to, on page 134, talk about ecological niches and species distributions. I will talk in class about the evidence for evolution. So let me cover this slide in class. Please remind me to cover this slide in class with you, because there's some things I want to say about all 5 of these evidences of evolution. Alright, so on page 134 we're going to talk about range of tolerance. We're going to talk about the difference between fundamental niche and realized niche. You probably remember from another biology course what a niche is. The species niche is the job that it has in the ecosystem, or perhaps it's what it eats, or perhaps it's what eats it. But it has a role to play in the ecosystem. That is its niche. Well, there's 2 types of niches, fundamental and realized. And then I want to introduce you to for the first time to this concept of species. Species can be talked about in terms of being either a generalist or a specialist. And I think I have the opportunity to talk about those things on a separate slides. No, it doesn't look like that I do. So let me talk about the generalists and the specialists right now. A generalist is a species that doesn't have much of a requirement to survive. Generalists have some of those characteristics of insects. They have fast generations. They give birth to thousands of offspring per pregnancy. They'll eat just about anything. If you take one food source away, they will be very inventive and find another food source. So those are the generalists. The specialists are organisms that have a very specific role in the ecosystem. They'll eat one thing and only one thing. A great example of a specialist is a panda. The poor panda will eat one kind of bamboo, I think I've mentioned that to you before, and nothing else. It doesn't matter what other food is available to the panda, it will starve to death rather than eat anything but that one specific species of bamboo. These are called specialist species. They generally have long gestation times. They have big differences in between their generation times. And they can't eat anything they want. They're very picky in what they will eat. So that's the difference between these two. We'll talk about them more in the next chapter, but for now I've introduced you to the concept. Alright, let's take a look at this range of tolerance thing. This range of tolerance is important because it helps to define what the fundamental niche is. The fundamental niche is the ideal condition for the species to do the 3 things it has to do: survive, grow, and reproduce. Now, that fundamental niche with the ideal conditions is where most of the organisms can survive. You all have learned about the bell-shaped curve before. This is where 66% of the organisms fall in the middle underneath the bell-shaped curve. The example here is using temperature. So there's some ideal temperature for this organism to survive, grow, and reproduce. If it's either too cold on this end or too warm on the other end, then organisms are not in their ideal condition anymore, and they start to die off. Well, in this case, it's not so much that they die off. They can still survive and grow, but they won't be able to reproduce. So their reproductive rate will be very, very low, and after a while, of course, the species will fail to keep up with the deaths in the species and become extinct. If we get even colder, in this range here, these organisms, there aren't very many of them, but they do have the ability to survive. They probably have some mutation, some genetic mutation that they never knew was an advantage before, but when they were in a particularly cold environment, they thrived. Well, at least they lived. They survived. They did not grow. They did not reproduce. And the same thing happens over here when it gets really, really, really too hot. So these two sides of the bell-shaped curve, the two tails we call them, on either the left side for cold or the right side for warm, is not the ideal situation. And so the species cannot do all the things that it needs to survive. That's called the fundamental niche. So this example here, the temperature range is the fundamental niche. Now that is slightly different from a realized niche. So the fundamental niche, once again then, is that it is all of the ideal conditions that a species can deal with. But the truth is, species can deal with more than just what's here with the fundamental niche. As you can see here, the species are able to survive even in colder conditions. It's just not ideal for them. So the realized niche is the range of abiotic and biotic conditions under which a species actually lives. That's called the realized niche. Fundamental niche is, again, all of the environmental conditions, the ideal environmental conditions that the species can live. The realized is more the actual. Last thing to cover in this chapter, let me see how many more of these things there are to go. Okay, just two more, is the idea of these mass extinctions. Of course, this is looking back and looking at the fossil record and taking a good guess. All right, I mean, all we can use is the fossil record to tell us that this is so. But it appears as though throughout history of organisms on the planet, and remember the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, and this only goes back a half a billion years old from zero. You have to read the graph. This is present, and this is working backwards in this direction. We can see from the fossil record times in Earth's history where there's been significant, just drastic drop in the number of species. You know, here's one of them. Here's another. You know, we have theories about why it happened. You know, one of the mass extinctions was the dinosaurs, and you've all heard the different theories that exist out there about what happened to the dinosaurs. There's a period of intense volcanism over a few million years. That all these volcanoes slowly but surely made life so inhabitable for the dinosaurs that there was mass extinction. Sometimes it can be a change in temperature of the oceans. All of the species that live in the oceans might have been killed off in another mass extinction. Anyway, we have 5, from the fossil record, and the reason that this is important, of course, the author brings out for you, is that because of all of the human activity, scientists are afraid that we're in a 6th mass extinction, And by the way, we're not going to have to wait 10 million years or 100 million years to witness and see all of these species be killed off. The estimates are between 2 and 25% of all of the species, all 2 million that we've identified so far, could be extinct by 2020. And of course, scientists agree that this is probably caused by our human footprint. Too many freaking people, and we're doing too many things, whether it's our technology, our burning of fossil fuels, our usage of water, the destruction we do to the water cycle. All those things, depending on the species, can be contributing towards what most scientists agree is a sixth mass extinction. That, my friends, is the end of chapter 5. And I promise you, I don't know if I want to promise. I'm here to tell you, you should look over those multiple choice questions at the end of chapter 5. There's 10 of them. And I'm guessing one way to tell if you're watching these videos is to know the questions at the end of this chapter. Alright, I'll see you guys later. Good night now.